Good Friday morning, everyone. Buenos dias a todos. Welcome to the Backyard Naturalist, where we gather each week to tell the extraordinary stories of our seemingly ordinary backyards. My name is Tim. I work at the Urban Ecology Center here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm delighted to be with you today for the world premiere of You Ain't Nothing But a Groundhog. Before we start, I'd like to express a huge show of gratitude for those of you that support this program through subscriptions and those of you who support the Urban Ecology Center as members, and a reminder that in 7 short hours, you can join us at the Washington Park Lagoon, my personal favorite of all of Milwaukee's lagoons, for an evening of ice skating and s'mores and a lot of good times. So for more details, you can visit the Urban Ecology Center website. I'm sad I won't be able to be there. I have to be down in Chicago, but I strongly encourage you to show up. And like we were talking about before the show started, the sun is up later, so half of that time at least there's going to be sun, and then it's really fun to watch Washington Park transition into darkness. From the human phenology world, we're about to switch to the month we call February, named from the Latin februum, which means purification, because of a ritual called februa that's held on the February full moon. And many cultures also celebrate this as a transition to a new year for those folks who use the lunisolar calendar. So happy New Year, happy Year of the Tiger in China, happy Losar in Tibet, happy Tet in Vietnam, the festival of the first morning of the first day, happy Seolal in Korea. February is also Black History Month, a time to celebrate, but also a time to reflect and relearn the stories we've been told, mainly from a white patriarchal perspective, a time to reflect on how we personally affect the social systems in our world. One small thing that I'm doing is re-listening to a podcast that I really appreciated the first time around, called Seeing White, season 2 of Seen on Radio. And I'd love some thought partners on this if you're interested in joining me in that journey. February 2nd is Sagansar in Mongolia, the White Moon Festival, also celebrating the lunisolar New Year. And February 2nd is Groundhog Day. And that means we are in for a double feature episode today. First, we're going to look at the natural history of the backyard critter we call the groundhog, and then move on to why the heck we have a whole holiday honoring this particular rodent, Marmota monax. So, what is a groundhog? For perspective, groundhogs are very closely related to two previous backyard naturalist superstars, the gray squirrel and the chipmunk. So if you need a refresher on where this group lives in the family tree of life and characteristics of these groups, you can go in the archives. And in the case of the gray squirrel, way back in the archives, you can see here it was the second episode in this entire series, right after the premiere of Desperate House Sparrows back in April of 2020, at the beginning of this giant global mess. The groundhog and the chipmunk are both considered ground squirrels in the Marmot tribe. So they're like first cousins, the most closely related of this trio of squirrels. And then the gray squirrel is a tree squirrel. So you have two ground squirrels and a tree squirrel. The tree squirrel, the gray squirrel, is a little more distant, maybe like a first cousin once removed, but they're all in the same family, all considered squirrels, either ground squirrels or tree squirrels, which are a type of eukaryotic rodent, mammal, animal with a backbone. Groundhogs and chipmunks are separated by genus, but they're both considered marmots. And even though they're considered marmots, we usually reserve the term marmot to talk about the 15 species of ground squirrels in the genus Marmota. So they're all mostly herbivores. Many are social, very social in the summer, and hibernate underground in the wintertime. These marmots are also the heaviest members of the squirrel family. And this is a picture of a yellow-bellied marmot found in the Western United States and Canada. The Latin name of the groundhog is Marmota monax, given by Carl Linnaeus back in 1758. And monax is the Algonquin name for the woodchuck, and it means digger. And after that, this large rodent carries just an inordinate number of common names for a critter with such a small stature. So in addition to groundhog, they are sometimes known as ground pig, if that makes sense, and the familiar woodchuck, which actually has nothing to do with chucking wood, despite the saying, but that comes from the Narragansett word for this animal, which is woodchuck. But woodchuck is stuck, and sometimes they're just referred to as chucks. So young groundhogs are chucklings. Some refer to them as woodcock. You've likely heard them referred to as whistlepig or just whistler, so named because of their tendency to chirp when they're in danger or during courtship. In the Northwest, they go by thickwood badger to distinguish it from the prairie badger, also known as the American badger. And my preferred name for them is the Canada marmot, which may be the most boring, but I think from a natural perspective, this one makes the most sense to me, most fitting. I've already mentioned they're known as monax and also moonac. And there's weenusk, red monk, land beaver, and among the French Canadians, the siffleux. So our groundhog doesn't really fit the marmot mold super well, because they don't, most marmots live in the mountains, they're alpine, and most marmots are really, really social. This is actually the least social of all the marmots, but even with that moniker, it's one of the most intelligent, and their limited social networks are really complex. They work cooperatively to form a complex system of burrows. They're important to maintaining healthy soils. And within this social network, as I mentioned, they communicate to each other through whistling. Like other rodents, their teeth grow constantly, so they keep them in check. They keep them trim through constant chewing. And it's interesting, the groundhog teeth are very, very white. And if you compare that to other rodents, look at pictures of beavers and other things, they often have that off-white yellow stain, but groundhog teeth are very white. They're pretty large, 15 pounds. They can live up to 8 years in the wild, in captivity up to 14. Their short, powerful legs and long claws are really well adapted for digging. So we usually see them when they're up feeding, but they're very, very good diggers. And for squirrels, they have relatively short tails, also an adaptation to digging. It has a pretty extensive range in the eastern United States and Canada, and even up into Alaska. They prefer open country and edges. So human farms, pastures, and hedgerows are really good habitat with a lot of access to food. And like many of these backyard naturalist featured critters, the groundhog has done quite well with the expansion of humans. I've seen them all around the city where they can thrive mostly free from predators, but they do have to be careful for coyotes, foxes, and dogs in particular. They rarely stray too far from their burrow system, and so that's their preferred mode of escape. So if they feel threatened, if they're noticing something's off, they'll stand upright, just like a prairie dog or a meerkat. And if they sense danger, they will often whistle first to warn others, and then try to make it back to their underground burrow system as quickly as possible. If that's not possible. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Are they related to prairie dogs?
They are less distantly, but yes, they are related to prairie dogs. Or more distantly, I should say. They're more distantly related to prairie dogs, but that's all I believe in the same group. If returning to their burrow is not possible, if they're cut off from their burrow, they're very good at swimming away from danger, so they're likely to be identified as a beaver in that stage. Or they're good at climbing trees to escape a predator. And both of these behaviors kind of surprise me. So if none of the escape routes are an option, they are also tough, and they will wield some sharp claws and teeth and put up a good fight. Sadly, in cities, it's really humans that are the biggest threat, either through the Orkin man because they're considered pests, and many succumb to cars. In Wisconsin, they were almost completely extirpated around 1950 by farmers who thought that they were destroying their crops. So they were excessively hunted, but now they're protected in Wisconsin and have rebounded. And in some areas like Kentucky, they're still hunted for sport, for food, and for fur. They're mostly herbivorous. eating grasses and other leafy vegetation, up to a pound of food a day. They'll also eat berries and grains and other types and parts of plants. Very occasionally, they'll eat small animals, insects, snails, and even an occasional baby bird. But they're much more herbivorous than most squirrels, which are more omnivorous. They will gorge themselves on food to fatten up for that long winter hibernation. And they don't really need to drink much. They get most of their liquid from plants, especially after a good rain or a morning dew. And I mentioned they're excellent burrowers. Here's one that's clearing out a burrow, and they spend time underground to sleep, to hibernate, to shelter from bad weather, to escape from predators, and to raise young. Burrows are very similar to the complex burrows we learned about in the chipmunk episode. So they can be up to 25 feet long, 3 feet below the surface. They have side galleries, they have bathroom chambers, multiple entryways. And despite their mostly solitary status, as I mentioned, several individuals will live in and cooperate in the building and maintenance of a burrow system. So you can imagine a big animal like this creating a big burrow system. They're moving a lot of dirt to just so that they can get around. They're one of the few species that enter into true hibernation. They build a separate winter burrow that's below the frost line so that their chamber stays above freezing. And they enter hibernation around October. Their body temperature drops to about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and their heart rate slows from 80 beats per minute in normal times down to 4 beats per minute during hibernation. And they can manage one breath about every 6 minutes. So this is full-on true hibernation. In February, coming up on Groundhog's Day, in February, animals will often be aroused from their torpor. They'll emerge from the burrow, and they'll socialize for a brief period of time before returning to their burrow for another few weeks, which may be doing a little bit of foreshadowing. In March, then they come out of their hibernation, they mate, they quickly try to regain much of their body mass that they lost during hibernation, and they're mostly diurnal, but like many mammals, they're more active in the morning and late in the afternoon. And as I mentioned, one of the first things they do after leaving their burrow is mate, usually with a neighbor that they socialized with during that brief time in February when they left their den before hitting the snooze button. Once the young are born, the young stay with their mothers until they're kicked out in kind of the late summer, and the father kind of leaves the scene once they're born. So that's a brief telling of the story of the animal behind Groundhog Day. So that's the end. Now you can all go to the lobby to get yourself some snacks before the curtain opens behind the saga of how this first story transmogrifies itself into the story of Groundhog Day, a decidedly Western celebration. And that story begins with a group of people that we refer to as the ancient Celts, a group of Indo-European people around several centuries before the Common Era, who found themselves always bickering with the Romans. Like many people at the time, they studied the heavens and they had a solid understanding of astronomy. They knew, for example, when the solstices and the equinoxes occurred, the solstices being the time when the poles are at their max tilt toward or away from the sun. So in the Northern Hemisphere, on the summer solstice, the North Pole is at the point where it's most directly pointed at the sun, which means we have the most direct sun rays, which gives us the longest periods of more intense heat and the longest days of the year. And then for us, the winter solstice is just the opposite. We're pointed away from the sun, which results in the shortest cycles of less direct heat and the shortest days and the coldest temperatures. The equinoxes in spring and fall characterize the point where no matter where you are on the planet, you receive 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night. So we're all equal at that point, except for those just at or near the poles. It gets a little more complicated, but that's not important for this story. What is important is that many of the current dominant cultures define their seasons by these 4 events. So the summer solstice, June 21st-ish, defines the beginning of summer. The fall equinox, September 21st-ish, defines the beginning of fall, and so on. And there's a more modern interpretation of seasons that we call the astronomical seasons that are slightly offset from the astrological, this is the meteorological system, which is slightly offset from the astronomic seasons. So we just went through the astronomic seasons are defined by the solstices and the equinoxes. The meteorological seasons are defined more by what each period feels like, when the seasons actually feel like the seasons. So by December 1st or even December 19th, it can be really cold, sweater and hot beverage season for sure. But astronomically, it's still fall until December 21st. And so at least here, around 43 degrees north latitude in the United States, it makes more sense to say winter begins at the beginning of December, spring begins at the beginning of March, and so on. But that's also not super important to this story. So continuing on what is important, the Celts define their season not by the solstices and equinoxes like we tend to today, but they define the seasons by what are called the cross-quarter days. So these are the days that are exactly halfway between the solstices and the equinoxes. And Josh Clark describes them as the seasonal hump days. So the time when we celebrate Groundhog Day, which is coming up in a few days, February 2nd, is the cross-quarter day that's halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. And to the Celts of all the cross-quarter days, well, so we should say the Celts celebrated all of the cross-quarter days. They were given names. So you have Imbole and Samhain, Lughnasadh and Beltane. And then later, when the Christian cultures took over the regions, they kept those celebrations. They kept the timing and even a lot of the cultural traditions of those cross-quarter days, and then just gave them new names like Candlemas, All Saints Day, Lammas, and May Day, but all had Celtic origins. So of all the cross-quarter days to the Celts, the spring one was the most celebrated. It symbolized a beginning, and they called it Imbole, or in the belly. So it's a symbol that the earth was going to give birth to the spring. And this is also marked by the time of lambing, when baby lambs were born. And if any of this is confusing, I'm just going to show some pictures of baby lambs to refocus your attention. That was an important part of the season. The spring cross-quarter was also called Brigantia for Brigid or Brigid, the female deity of life. And it marked a time in the northern latitudes that the sun is coming out of hiding, just as we were talking about before this talk. And so again, as is the case with a lot of other holiday origin stories, the one group adopted it from another. In this case, the Christians adopted from the Celts, and the timing and many of the traditions of Brigantia, the celebration of life and the sun, became the festival of lights, or Candlemas. But this was all just, more than just a time to look at cute baby lambs. This was to the Celts and people before and after them all around the world, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. The spring cross-quarter marked a really important time for farmers or anybody that was growing crops as the time to start thinking about when to plant your crops. And this is super important. If you plant too early, you risk losing your crops to a hard frost, but you also need those crops to be planted as soon as possible. So you don't want to plant too late either. So without the advanced meteorological techniques, which, let's be honest, aren't all that accurate, but without our advanced techniques, farmers back in the day had to use other signs of when to plant. And to be fair, these people were amazing scientists. They gained knowledge by paying close attention to the world as if their lives depended on it, because it did. And people for millennia have needed to predict when food sources would migrate, when plants would bloom. And with the advent of agriculture, they needed to know when to sow their crops. So that's one of the reasons they were all such good astronomers. The heavens help predict important climatic and weather events, but they're still subject to the vagrancies and unpredictable nature of the world. So beyond the astronomy, they tended to look elsewhere for a bit of help. And this is where those kind of farmer's almanac type observations came about. And they used animals and plants to help predict this really unpredictable process. So for example, people paid attention to the number and size of spider webs in the fall to try to predict the weather next spring. They looked at the thickness of corn husks to try to predict next spring's condition. They looked at the timing and nature of goose migration in the fall and that of other birds. They looked at how frantic squirrels were in their gathering nut process in the fall. And they looked at, I think my favorite, the thickness and number of bands on the woolly bear caterpillar as a predictor. And so while this seemed like a shameless plug for the Backyard Naturalist archived episodes, which are available online, it also illustrates the traditions of using common wildlife to help try to predict natural events. Okay, enter the badger, the European badger. And we go to Germany. Somewhere, a tradition started at Candlemas when farmers were trying to predict when to plant their crops. And someone decided to go and wake up a sleeping badger, which just seems like a bad idea all around. But they decided to do that. And then they determined that if that badger that they just woke up would crawl immediately back into its burrow, that was a sign that winter still had a stronghold and that the farmer should delay planting their crops. It's just not ready. But if the badger stretched, rubbed its sleepy eyes, and said, all right, let's get cracking, that was a sign that winter was ending and that it was safe to plant your crops because the badger. So to a farmer, that, I don't know, maybe that seems like a safe bet, right? You know, badgers are probably more attuned to nature. They probably know some things, can sense some things that we don't know. Why they just didn't wait for the badger to emerge on their own is a little beyond me. It seems like a much more solid plan and avoids badger-related injuries of waking up a grumpy badger. But the tradition stuck. The badger tradition stuck. And then we moved to North America, and Germans moved to North America, to Pennsylvania. And somebody, maybe it was this fellow here, thought, I don't see any badgers here. So what's another animal that I can find that burrows in the ground and hibernates that I can wake up and it can tell me whether or not to plant my crops? And from that point on, the groundhog was inextricably linked to February 2nd, to the spring cross-quarter day when farmers are thinking about their crops. So we, as Americans, put our own stamp on the tradition. Somewhere along the lines, the story changed from, does the badger want to go back to sleep, to, does the groundhog see its shadow, which scares it back to its den, meaning 6 more weeks of winter. And if you're keeping score, Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow way more often than not. And not only is he not an accurate predictor, sorry, Phil, Phil would have been more successful predicting winter by flipping a coin. He has been wrong 61% of the time. So, but it's interesting to kind of speculate if there are any hints of accuracy in using the sun to predict the weather. It's a complex system, and the closest I can come to kind of explaining this is that, you know, sunny days like right now, that indicates high pressure and stable air, and cloudy days indicate low pressure and less stable air. So one could make a long stretch that if it's sunny, we expect current conditions to stay around for a while. And if current conditions are winter, if it's cloudy, a change. If it's currently winter, maybe we're changing to spring. But it doesn't make sense, particularly when you're looking at one day, in fact, a particular moment in a day that has no predictive value. But if it solidifies your hopes as to how the spring will be, there may be a psychological value or detriment in following the prediction. And it's fun. And really, from a natural history perspective, not to be a homer here, but I think the groundhog is a way better choice than a badger because of that habit I mentioned earlier. Groundhogs are really territorial during the summer, especially. They fight with each other all the time, and they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're waking up on their own from their hibernation to come out, and they use that early period to kind of re-strengthen bonds, to make up with their neighbors, kind of reset and say, hey, sorry for all the biting I did to you last year. I'm going to go back to bed, but when I wake up later, maybe we should mate. So groundhogs will naturally emerge from their burrows just for a little while, do this little social bonding, disappear again, and then come out for good a few weeks later. Again, infinitely better, in my opinion, to use an animal that's going to wake up anyway than to poke a sleeping badger. And there you have it, a journey that brought us from cross-quarter day Celtic traditions and attempts to better understand when to plant the crops, to this strange man in a top hat holding up a big rodent to a crowd of 20,000 people. And I'm a little sad the story doesn't end in Ohio, because it seems like all of the other fun animal celebration days, from vultures to woolly bears, happen in Ohio, as is often proudly pointed out by Backyard Naturalist subscribers Corey and Ivy. And there is a much longer story behind the celebration at Gobbler's Knob, a really interesting story. Dates back to 1841. It's the first mention of Groundhog Day, and it involves the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club, which initially was formed to hunt and eat groundhogs, again seen as pests to farmers. But now it's like, it's full on X-Files, full of these structures with an elite group of leaders that, only a few of them can handle the star groundhog. Only one person, the president of the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club, is allowed to communicate with Phil. And Phil is not a wild groundhog. He's very, very pampered throughout the year. And according to the society, Phil is the same individual groundhog that has been around since the late 1800s on Gobbler's Knob. So Punxsutawney Phil was renamed in the 50s after Prince Philip of England. But before that, he was known as Brer Groundhog. And again, according to the society, this individual groundhog has been kept alive for 135 years, because every summer during the Summer Groundhog Festival, also at Gobbler's Knob, there's the Groundhog Day Festival, and then another summer celebration just because. So during the summer celebration, Phil is fed a dandelion punch that's a life elixir that has kept him alive for 135 years. But on Groundhog Day itself, I meant, 20,000 people hanging out, listening to music, being cold, and the party starts at 3:30 in the morning, and they're partying from 3:30 to 6:30 when the official ceremony begins, and they can witness the presentation of Punxsutawney Phil. So it's strange. And on that note, I encourage you all to have a happy Groundhog Day. We can all appreciate the natural beauty in the Canada marmot as an animal that's intelligent and complex, and the strange traditions that humans have brought to the whistle pig. So with that, thank you for joining me today. I will stop sharing my screen.